Next up, we had the pleasure of visiting with story potter Courtney Kaplan about her art and studio she has at the base of the beautiful Bighorn Mountains.
Well, my grandparents from Nebraska built a summer cabin here in the 40s, and we used to come out from Lincoln, Nebraska, come out here, spend idyllic summers in Story, Wyoming, riding horses and, playing in the creek and all that. And then when my grandmother died in '77, I became the caretaker of that family cabin. I started out in college majoring in the arts, and then I switched to the sciences, and then I switched back to the arts. I never could make up my mind, and eventually found myself at the Tucson Museum of Art School in Tucson. And I had a wonderful pottery teacher there. And it's really because she was such a great teacher and her teacher was such a great teacher that I kept with it. I studied weaving and spinning and metalsmithing, but pottery stuck, and part of it is just that practical nature of if you mess up, you can just throw it back and start over, So it gives you permission to experiment. And I think what I eventually realized is that I'm good at hands-on things. And I always liked to make things. So when my sister said, well, why don't you come down to the Tucson Museum of Art School and study, I just thought, okay, yeah, sure. And it just clicked with me, so I have a lot of empathy for people that maybe not everybody's great at book learning or sitting in one place, and I got to be up and moving around and doing things. And the other thing besides just liking to make pots is I really like building things. So in 1984, I took a rammed earth workshop from a wonderful guy in Casper at college, Jug Brandjord, who has since passed on, but he was in his 50s at the time. And he was building rammed earth in the round in Casper, in part because he was a blacksmith and a minister and a geologist, and he had taken scrap metal from a 40-foot oil tank in Casper, and he built this round form. And so he had several houses in the round in Casper, and when I saw a model he had at the workshop of this house, which was 2 stories in the middle, I had one of those little cardboard makeups, and I said, I really want that. And he said, okay, I'll come up. And he was the kind of, put a crew together, and we all just started working on it. That was 1985. I'm what you'd call a studio potter. I'm not like a factory potter where, you make all of one kind of glaze and one kind of thing. And people have asked before, why don't you go on Etsy or Pinterest and market online? But as you can see walking around my studio, I have so many different glazes that every kiln load that I take out it's kind of like Christmas. It's different. I have many different glazes, and I'm always changing my mind. So mostly I just make good functional pots based on the Japanese method of throwing that I learned from my teachers. Right now I've just got my wheel here, which, by the way, my master potter Harry Hall on Cape Cod, he built this wheel. And I weighed out my clay. This is just about 3 pounds. It's not a lot, but you slap it into place. You can see already it's starting to look not centered necessarily, but okay. So I also have these handmade tools, which are that's fiberglass sheeting that I made various shapes of what we call, these are ribs. And you'll see what I do with them in a minute. So when you're making a pot, you want to wet the clay. First pull is down, because you always want the center to be the high point. Because if you fold that center in on itself, that center will eventually be the floor of your pot and it will create a crack. So first thing I do, even though I'm making a bowl, is I get it up high. And I'm using, I'm using plenty of water, but often what a beginning potter mistake will be is they'll just make it too wet. They'll play around with the clay too long. And so I want to make sure it feels right all the way from the bottom up. So when it feels pretty good, bring it down. Make kind of a knob here and slow the wheel down, because really you only need that wheel fast while you're centering. So then take both my thumbs and you'll open up that pot. Now, another common mistake when you're just beginning is you'll open it up too far and you'll go all the way down to the bat you're on, but you want to leave enough for a nice floor. And first pull up. And actually it doesn't even need to go that fast, so I'm going to slow it down. So then I'll take this fiberglass rib and it helps me really shape the pot. So when you're making a pot, even if it's a bowl, you want to get all your height first, because you can't make it high later. So I got my height. I'm going to reinforce this floor a little bit. I love making candelabras, and at one point I went down to Mexico and I visited all of these Mexican potters on a Wyoming Arts Council grant. This was about 30 years ago, who make these candelabras they call arboles de vida, which are like trees of life. And you've probably seen them. They're, big terracotta, and they have Adam and Eve and birds and flowers and leaves and trees and all this stuff. And I was really inspired by them. And so there's a couple of candelabras over there, as well as some candlesticks. The way you make a candelabra is I throw different components on the wheel, and then I take them off the wheel and basically assemble them. So the last thing I did there was I used some of this fishing line. I cut off the bottom, because if you don't do that, it sort of sticks to this bat. And so now this is some, you don't want to touch it just yet, but it will dry a little bit. Like I threw those mugs yesterday afternoon, and in a little bit I'll be able to pick them up and turn them over and trim them, and then put handles on them. So it's a phase. You start with, you work the clay up, you throw a pot, you let it dry, you turn it over, you trim it. Yeah, I actually have two kilns. I have in my back room, I have an electric kiln, which is usually a first firing. If I was working, like today, if I was working in stoneware, which is my next clay to work in, and I work in 4 different kinds of clay. This terracotta is a lower temperature clay, so it fires, I think it's around 1800 degrees. And if you actually took it up to 2400, it would like melt and basically ruin the kiln. So terracotta is really great for planters. It's breathable, and there's an example of some hanging cactus in there that show you what these hanging terracotta planters will look like. So they just are going to be a one-shot firing. They only need to be fired once because I'm not putting a glaze on them. The stoneware, the porcelain, the flameware, it's a different deal. They get made, they get trimmed, they get their handles put on, whatever, then they dry, bone dry, which is kind of what these little African violet planters are right now. They're dry to the touch. That's when I would take a stoneware piece or a porcelain piece and put it in my electric kiln and fire it the first time to sort of a medium temperature. And that creates what you call a bisque pot, which basically is kind of a half-fired pot, but it's strong enough that you can pick it up, still quite porous, and that's when you glaze it. And I make all my own glazes here and some of my own clay too. So the clay I'm getting right now is from the Archie Bray Pottery Center in Helena, Montana. And I've also, like in my back shed, I do have a clay maker, and there is one particular body of clay that I make that no one else makes in Wyoming called flameware. Flameware I learned to make from my teacher in Cape Cod, Harry Hole. Flameware basically is a clay that it's a high fire clay, but it's actually, you can actually put it on the stove, under the broiler, take it from the freezer, put it in a hot oven, and it doesn't break. So I've made frying pans out of it and tea kettles, and mostly I just market it as the ultimate casserole bakeware because it's got a lot of thermal shock absorption that like regular stoneware doesn't have.
If you are interested in learning more about Piney Creek Pottery or would like to purchase some pieces, please visit Courtney at her studio in Story or give her a call at 307-683-2181.